So we have Michelle Tepper, and she's going to be coming up here in a moment. Here she comes. And she's going to be speaking to you guys about where is God when it hurts. I want to let you know something. Michelle flew in all the way from the UK, from England, to be here with you guys. Her arms must be tired. Yeah, really? I didn't expect you guys to get that one. Students, can we give it up, please, for Michelle Tepper?
Thanks, yeah. Well, I don't mean to disappoint you, but I flew all the way from London, but I don't have that glorious accent. And I will tell you why. Because I am a defector, if you will. 13 years ago, I moved from the wonderful, sunny state of Florida to Oxford. I thought it would be for 8 weeks study abroad, and 13 years later, I have never left. My mother never forgave me. I met my husband over there. I have a beautiful daughter who's 5 years old called Sophia, and I've done different things, working with students, working with the church. Now I work full-time with the RZIM European office that's based in Oxford, but I'm moving back to North America this summer. The sun finally will come out tomorrow. I am so happy. Yes, that deserves a round of applause. I always believed that song from Annie until I moved to the UK, because the sun might not come out tomorrow, or the next day, or the next day. It might be 9 months, and then you get really sad. But we are here in this topic to talk about, I would say, arguably one of the most difficult questions for most people in life. Where is God when it hurts? Where is God when it hurts? And I want to start off really honest with you, okay? Really, really honest with you. I fully believe that there will never be a perfect answer to this question that I could give you or that anyone else could give you in answer format. And before you get upset, before you go, why am I even sitting through this? Let me tell you why. Because the problem of pain and suffering meets every single person in every single age, from every single background of life, whether you're a Christian or not, there is pain and suffering. And even if you do believe that there is a God or someone or something out there that is responsible, that could be asked for this question, let me ask you a question back first. You think of, please, for a moment, the most terrible tragedy or suffering that either you or a loved one maybe has gone through. Just for a moment. Because you know what? I'm not going to patronize you guys and say, oh, you're young, one day you come in suffering. I know that you all have faced real hurt and pain on some level, or you know someone that has. Maybe you're facing it right now. And I want you to think of it for a moment, not to get emotional, just to be honest. If God himself were to stand before you right now and say, this is exactly the reason why you went through that, or why you are going through that, would it have made it hurt any less when you went through it? It would give you reasons, but it could not and would not take away the suffering. It couldn't. Now, I speak on this subject from a very personal point of view. I want to give you a brief story, and then I'm going to go into the talk. And I don't often tell this story related to this talk, because it's not technically my story, it's my husband's story. But as I was praying this morning and thinking about how to address you guys and your age range, it came to me. So my husband grew up in Madrid. His parents were missionaries. They worked with homeless and drug addicts in Madrid. They dedicated their whole lives. In fact, my father-in-law still lives in Madrid 40 years later, to helping people that were addicted to heroin. Before the days when travel was as easy as it is now, missionaries often stayed much more longer terms, and they would stay maybe 4, 5, 6 years and then go back to their home country for a longer stint, like a year. So it was the very first long break that my in-laws ever got, and they brought their 4 sons My husband is number 3 in the lineup back. Most of them had never experienced American culture before. They were so excited to have a rest. The mission organization had given them a house. They were going on trips. They were just so excited to have this time together. And very soon, right when they got back, there was an opportunity for my father-in-law to take my husband and his 3 brothers on a daddy trip while the mom got pampered to go to a women's retreat. And as my mother-in-law drove away, she looked at my father-in-law and just went, I just don't think that you should take the boys today to this trip. They were going to go up and explore Kitty Hawk where the first plane went off. And she just left to go and finally get some rest and relaxation that she desperately needed. And the boys finally had dad to themselves because dad was always there, but so busy helping the homeless and the marginalized. Well, they were in a van all together, and they were all buckled up. And my husband's youngest brother, Timothy, a couple weeks before he was about to turn 10, was sitting in the front, and they hit a pothole, and the van rolled. And when the van readied themselves, everybody was in the car except for Timothy. Timothy was back in the street. And when they went out, he was still alive. But by the time they got to the hospital, he had taken his final breath. I am not saying that to evoke an emotional response, but Timothy hadn't turned 10 yet. My husband was 13 years old. He's had even other things that have happened in his life, but this has defined him. Maybe some of you have stories like this. Maybe some of you might face stories like this. Even if you haven't, the world faces stories of pain. It might not be on this level. It might be bullying. It might be betrayal. It might be loneliness. There is pain and suffering across the world. And if you do away with God, if you decide, I could never believe in God, I could never be a Christian because of all this pain and suffering in my life or in the world, or you fill in the blanks, guess what? Somebody still has to answer the question of why there is pain and suffering. Doing away with the God of the Bible, doing away or rejecting Jesus Christ does not answer the question that still stands. Well, then why is there pain and suffering? And that's really what we're going to get at today. At the end of the day, suffering won't go away if you reject God. So I think the greatest question for you to ask yourselves today, honestly, don't just take my word for it by the end of the day, ask yourself questioning, is what worldview? Worldview means the lens through which you see the world, the lens through which you understand life. I like to use that phrase better than religion because atheism is so prolific these days. So don't say what religion, because someone might say, well, I have no religion. What worldview? What system of thought, what person, what Facebook blog you just read best gives you an answer to why is there pain and suffering? Because everybody, atheist, Buddhist, 13-year-old, 45-year-old, 101-year-old, has to answer this question in life. And when I ask that question, it reminds me of a place in the Bible. And note this down. You don't have to turn to me today, but it's in John chapter 6. Right after Jesus feeds the 5,000. People are like, wow, we just had the best bread we've ever tasted, the best fish you've ever tasted. And suddenly there's a huge crowd following Jesus because they're like, he's the free lunch man. And he turns water into wine. I'm following him. And they show up en masse right after they got fed. And Jesus turns to them this time, and he looks at them, and he goes, you don't want to know what I have to say. You're here for lunch again. And he says a whole bunch of hard things about himself. And he goes, and by the way, there's not a free lunch today. And it says lots of people left him and were offended. They felt betrayed. They felt let down. Possibly they felt hurt by God, by Jesus. And then he turned to his followers later in the day and he went, so guys, I'm not the popular one anymore. Are you going to leave me too? And it says in John chapter 6 that his disciples looked at him. This is verses 66 to 69, if you want to look it up later. And they said, Lord, to who else are we going to go? Yeah, maybe you let them down. Maybe you let us down. We would have wanted something else too. We don't understand why you answered that way this time. But where else is there? There's no other option, only you. Hold the words of life. And that is the argument. And it's not really an argument. That's the passion of my life when it comes to this subject. Okay? Just because I gave you that story, I know it doesn't fit every single thing, but I firmly believe, to who else are we going to go? There's no other worldview. There's no other person. There's no other answer but the answer that Jesus Christ presents that gives us a satisfactory answer to this problem of pain and suffering. Because every single worldview, as I said, must answer these three questions to grapple with pain and suffering, okay? Here we go. These are the three questions. I'm going to take you through a couple different worldviews a little bit more rapidly here. I have this awesome colleague. His name is Oz Guinness. I don't know if any of you have ever heard of him before. Look him up. He's kind of like a 70-ish version of James Bond. It's amazing. And he's married to one of the first 4 American supermodels in America. And he speaks amazing truths, but he's so cool. And he always says this, and I can't speak because he's Oz Guinness. He's from the Guinness family, so his great accent, right? And he says, contrast creates clarity. So really quickly, we're just going to contrast a couple different worldviews answers to these three questions. First, why? Why is there suffering? Second, after we see what worldview answers that, can anyone save me? Or is there a way out? Okay? And third, are those two answers that you've just given me livable? Can I deal with that? Okay? So why is there suffering? Can anybody save me? And is this livable? Picking up the pace just a little bit. You with me, guys? I've been up since 4. I'm jet lagged, okay? I know that you got up early, but so did I. So let's look at the secular answer, okay? Or the naturalist answer. What new atheism, the likes of Richard Dawkins, would tell us, okay? First off, why is there suffering? If you're coming from a purely naturalistic, a purely secular atheist view, okay, even new atheism, where you believe that there is no order to this universe, everything is random, everything is meaningless. Well, actually, this first question you can't even ask. Don't ask, why is there suffering? Suffering, just like everything else in this universe, has no meaning. You can't try to understand it. Asking why you're suffering, crying out to the universe, because there's nobody there, there's no design, there's no plan. Why did my daughter die of cancer? Why did my boyfriend break up with me? Why did that place just get bombed and things that are happening on the news? Why? There is no one to ask why to. There's no order, rhyme, or reason. So the question why is meaningless. Okay, well, let's try to move on to the next question. Well, then, can anybody save me? Is there any solution? Because naturalism, secularist views, still says there is suffering, okay? They don't say there isn't suffering, but they just say you can't ask why. So is there any solution to this problem of suffering? Well, there's no one greater, no order, no creator, no designer, greater than you out there. So, if you're going to survive, if you're going to get through, if you're going to save yourself from the suffering, guess who it's up to? It's survival of the fittest. You better learn to adapt, because suffering's going to come randomly. We can't predict when it's going to happen, but it's definitely still going to come. So learn to adapt, learn to survive, or guess what happens? You'll be extinct. That's just the way of the world. That is just the way of the world. Now, is this a livable answer? Because we hear these type of things when it comes to biology or chemistry or different things. And in those frame of minds, in some ways we understand. And that's why we have big questions about the Bible and science and order. Because actually there is a compelling argument to some facets of naturalism, right? But take a step to that livability question. Is the answer that there is no meaning or order to suffering, and you either adapt or you're extinct, period. That's it. Is that a livable worldview for most people? I don't believe it is. Let me give you 2 really quick illustrations to prove my point. First off is our good friend, Mr. Dawkins, who lives in Oxford, just behind where our offices are, okay? He, within the last year, was on a radio program in BBC, a local BBC one, and he was raging against the fact that all these Christians don't understand or know their Bible at all. And they talk about things, but as Nathan said earlier, they actually haven't read their Bible, and they can't quote things perfectly. To which the presenter said to Mr. Dawkins, now this presenter wasn't a Christian, he goes, that's actually a really strong argument you made. But Richard, could you just tell me one thing? Could you give me the full title of Darwin's Origin of Species? And he went, well, the Origin of Species. He said, well, yes, no, but I would like the full title of the Origin of Species. To which Mr. Dawkins started and then stopped, and then started and then stopped and stumbled, and he just went, oh, God, forgive me for saying that today. But kind of funny that all he was about to suffer on radio was public humiliation. Just a little bit, because it was an early morning program. Probably not that many people were listening to it. But even at that moment, what did he do? He cried out to God for help. Yes, he didn't mean it that way, but interestingly enough, about to suffer a little bit of embarrassment. And it's like, oh, help, I don't remember. Let's take it a little bit more personal. For 7 years, I was a university student pastor in the center of Oxford. And we got lots of students from lots of different backgrounds. And one student he came along to lots of our events because he liked the community, but he just hadn't made his mind up. And he was a staunch atheist, as that's how he described himself. He came and he knocked on mine and Peter's door one day. That's my husband. And he said, something scary just happened to me today. I was running across the street, late to my tutorial, and I didn't see a bus. And it was a near miss. And in that moment, I begged a God I don't believe in to save me. Is the answer that suffering is meaningless and there's no one but yourself to survive a livable answer? You decide for yourself. Let's look at another worldview. What about kind of Eastern religion and mysticism? Now, I in no way am trying to roll everything up into one, but also I want to get to a lot of this argument. So I'm just going to highlight one particular form. Let's take Buddhism for example, okay? If you start off with the idea of why is there suffering, okay, they acknowledge that suffering is at the heart of life. It's actually at the heart of life. There is suffering there, the heart of every individual's life. And in some ways, Buddhism is what you could call a religion-sized answer to the problem of pain and suffering. But here is what they say. Okay? The whole reason why we have suffering as individuals is because our individuality, being someone in and of ourselves, is just an illusion. Okay? Our illusion that we are someone in and of ourselves, we are an individual that can have thoughts and desires and meanings, that is what leads us to suffering. Okay? And so if you can figure out that you're not really an individual, if you can just make yourself extinct. That's what nirvana is, an endless lake of extinction. And if you can lose your individuality, then you won't desire anything anymore, and then you won't suffer. Because if you don't desire anything, then there's nothing to feel bad about if you don't get it. And until you figure out how to reach this level of extinction of your individuality, of nirvana, you will just go around the wheel and be reborn again and again and again till you finally figure out, I'm not an individual. There's nothing I need to desire. So who can save you in this? Well, the answer then is that you need to learn to suppress and renounce all of your desires and your individuality and become extinct. Complete detachment from life. Make yourself extinct. Become one with the universe, and you won't suffer anymore. Now, I'm not trying to make light up. There's a lot of celebrities. There's a lot of people that think, that's it. Lose my desire. It kind of makes sense, doesn't it? In some ways, it does make sense. That's one of the things I want you guys to draw away from. We don't mock. We don't make light. We need to grapple. A lot of ways, certain things do make sense or sound appealing if they don't make sense, right? A lot of the things we say make sense these days is what feels right to us, isn't it? It sounds nice. Renounce desires. I won't suffer anymore. But let's get to that final question again. Is this livable? Is this livable? Maybe one of the best illustrations of it is an 18th century Japanese poet who wrote haiku. You familiar with haiku? Those little different syllables and things. I've never been good at it. Never, whatsoever. His name was Issa, and he lost his wife and then 5 children to a disease, one after another, after another, after another. And he kept coming to his Zen master going, what do I do? What do I do? Because he was feeling this suffering, right? And the master kept telling him, the world is due. The world is due. Meaning it's all transient. Just remember, none of it's real. It's an illusion. It's not about individualities. And he wrote probably his most famous haiku poem, why he is famous in Japan. And this is what he wrote. The world is due. D-E-W, by the way. I've heard my accent is hard on that. The world is due. The world is due. And yet, is it livable to just say, I won't desire anything anymore, and then nothing will hurt me? Well, what about just spirituality in general? Okay, I'm going quickly hitting the bases here. We've hit kind of a secularist, naturalist, new atheist response. We've hit a little bit of Eastern mysticism over here. Really largely, I would say at least in the West, in the North America region, and definitely in Britain and a lot of Europe, just it's becoming more and more popular to just be spiritual. Yeah? You don't really assign yourself to anything. I'm just a little bit spiritual. Well, new spirituality tends to take a little bit of everything. They blend this hope of evolutionary advancement. Did any of you watch, it's been a few years now, I'm showing my age, that program Heroes? People that were kind of, I got some hands up. Okay, I'm not as old as I thought I was. Yes. Okay? You know, they're hoping that one day humans, we're going to just evolve, evolutionize, and we're going to be able to control things, kind of like X-Men that we never were able to before. So they blend this kind of hope of distant evolutionary advancement from naturalism, right? And then they take a little bit of the Eastern mysticism usually, some of the meditation and some of the different things, and they fuse it together. But interestingly enough, a lot of this new spirituality, when you ask these questions, you have to flip things on its head. Because why am I suffering is hard to answer if you really are the greatest force in the universe. Because most of new spirituality is about channeling your energy, channeling your power, harnessing that evolutionary advancement, getting to the thing where you control everything. In essence, you are God of your own universe. Nothing can happen unless you will it to happen, whether consciously or unconsciously. Okay? So then, if you ask the question, why am I suffering? If you're the most powerful thing in the universe and you're still suffering, what does that say? What does that say? Well, let me tell you what it says according to someone called Rhonda Byrne. She wrote The Secret, okay? And that was a while ago. And many of you might not have come across it, but it was on best-selling lists for a long, long time. It has sold more than 19 million copies worldwide and has been translated into 46 languages, okay? And if you watched the Bling Ring or something like that came out a couple years ago, it was a whole bunch of kids that took on this way of thinking, of positive thinking, and decided to take things into their own hand and rob some celebrities. So go out and look at it. It's a Sofia Coppola movie, and it talks about this a little bit. But Rhonda Byrne says this: who's responsible for suffering if you were the most powerful person in the universe? And I quote, 19 million sold. If you are poor, it is your fault because you are blocking money from coming to yourself with your thoughts. If you are in a car accident, you have no one to blame but yourself. That's where new spirituality gets you. If you're the most powerful person in the universe and there's still suffering in your life, it's your fault. Sort your power regimes out, and things might get a little bit better. Okay, so we've looked a little bit at secularism, we looked a little bit at naturalism, we looked a little bit at new spirituality and some Eastern stuff. Let's come to some monotheisms. Let's come to looking at Islam, Judaism, and Christianity, okay? Three main ones that would say God in some response to pain and suffering. Let's start with Islam. Did you know that Islam, the very word itself, means submission? Don't know if you're familiar with that. Islam means submission. When you ask these questions, why am I suffering? The very first thing that someone, an Orthodox Muslim, would say is that Islam means submission. Nothing in this universe, nothing in this world can happen outside the will of Allah. All good and all bad comes directly from Him. That's what Islam says. All good and all bad comes directly from Him. So asking the question, why am I suffering and who can save me, in Islam and an Orthodox view is a little bit problematic. Because if nothing can happen that Allah has not willed, then Allah is the source and reason of suffering that you are facing. Allah is also the only one powerful enough to save you, but if he has willed your suffering, you cannot question his will, because that is the highest form of blasphemy. There's no crying out, why am I suffering? Because if it has been willed and you ask why and it's come from him, you're blaspheming the name of Allah. The only choice there is to submit. Now I ask you this, is that livable? Is that livable? My brother is a Marine, and my husband was Special Forces in the U.S. Army before I met him. I met him when he was like Oxford nerdy. And they told me stories of different British troops that relayed stories back from training up Afghani soldiers after kind of Afghanistan was calmed down. They were trying to reteach soldiers different war techniques. One time, they were teaching some Afghani soldiers how to swim with big packs on their back. And they were saying, jump into the pool and then swim back up. Jump into the pool and then swim back, to try to teach them resistance. And two jumped in. One came up with this pack on the back, and the other guy was just down there in the bottom of the water, waiting. Finally, the commanding officer jumped in, pulled this guy up, could you not swim? What's going on? Are you all right? And he just answered, Inshallah, which means, if Allah wills it. And he said, if Allah wanted me to live, then I lived. If he wanted me to die, I would have died. Obviously, he wanted me to live. Is it livable to just say whatever comes from Allah, bad and good, I can't question it. I can't question it. Just deal with it. So what about Judaism and Christianity? What about Judaism and Christianity? And I want us to really kind of rub some of these nitty-gritty things, because certain things I probably just said, you might have thought, well, I thought God was like that in Christianity. So let's really kind of get down to some of the nitty-gritties. First off, the question, why am I suffering? It's really, really important, if you are a Christian or if you're considering the Christian faith, that you understand today that the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Yahweh, the same God that we believe in, if you are a Christian or if you're considering the Christian faith, is altogether good. He has always been good and always will be good. He never changes. He is not the source of good and evil like Allah. We don't believe that in the Christian faith. He is not yin and yang, a little bit of dark and a little bit of light. No evil can come from our good God. Suffering is very real. Both the Christian and Jewish worldview say there is suffering in this life. It is really real. We must cry out. We must cry out for justice. But God is not the source of the suffering, because God never intended for life to be fraught with the suffering that it is. So what happens then, you might ask, if you're coming from a Christian or Jewish viewpoint? And you go, okay, you're saying God's good, but there's a lot of suffering. So what happened? C.S. Lewis, famous for Narnia, you might have read some of his other things, put it this way. He said, free will, though it makes evil possible, is also the only thing that makes possible any love or goodness or joy worth happening. And this is how both the Jewish and the Christian framework begin their response to that question. Why is there suffering and pain and evil and injustice in our world? It begins to get to the heart of why. Because there was and there is and there always has been a God who is totally good and is totally love and is totally truth and is totally life. But because he is a God of relationship, but because he is truly a God of love and he really is good, he didn't just force the people that he created to agree with him. He didn't just force us to be in relationship with him. He said, here I am, be in relationship with me. I want to walk with you. I want to talk with you. Come if you want. But what happened? What always happens? We take one step away from God and we go, but maybe if I do it this way, I got to figure out for myself. Now, did God move? Did he go, you bad, bad Christian? You wanted to check things out without me. now I smite you. No, God stays the same. But what happens? You take one step away from good, it gets a little bit more evil, doesn't it? You take one step away from the light, it gets a little bit more dark. And so the evil and the pain and the suffering and everything that humanity faces in this world is because we decided, you know what? It's great, God, that you offer us goodness and safety and clarity, but we want to see if we can be God ourselves. We want to see if we can do it on our own. We want to choose something other than you. And so suddenly we're plunged into darkness. God hasn't moved, but we've moved. Does that make sense? That begins to get to the heart of it. If we reject a God who is love, goodness, and righteousness, then all we're left with is hate, evil, and injustice. Well, let's get to that second question. So we've looked at a little bit why there's suffering. Well, who can save me? This is where Christianity and Judaism part paths. The Jewish worldview does believe that a Redeemer, a Messiah, one day will come and rescue his people that he loves so much. He will come and fight for them in their suffering, and they're desperately hoping that redemption will come one day. But Christianity, where Nathan ended this morning, says, who can save me? Christianity says that God himself has come down in the midst of the pain and the suffering of our world that we created to save us, to heal us through his Son, Jesus Christ. Who can save me? God himself can, and God himself has, and he will continue to do so. Interestingly enough, one of the most famous atheists, Nietzsche, if you've heard of him before, said this, not talking about Jesus Christ. He was talking about Greek gods. He said the gods justify the atrocities of human life by living it themselves. The only satisfactory response to this problem of God and suffering that has ever been given. It's interesting that even someone that comes from such a bleak atheistic worldview would go, the only possible explanation for a world of pain and suffering and the existence of a God is if that God himself would suffer. Well, guess what? Did you know that Christianity is the only worldview and is the only religion that not only says God has suffered, but we're the only one that claims that God even can suffer? That's unthinkable in other faiths. If there is a God, he's too holy, he's too transcendent. He wouldn't get himself messed in the middle of human suffering. Who can save me? God himself steps in and suffers. Suffers on the cross, yes, but not just suffers there. He actually suffers human emotion. He gets let down. He gets betrayed. He feels hungry. He gets exhausted. He goes through every single thing that you and I have ever faced or will ever face. Who can save me? But is this a livable answer? Is this a livable answer? Well, I think asking and answering that question from a Christian worldview raises a couple more questions. One might be, and you might not have wrestled with this before, but let me tell you the truth. If you begin to wrestle with it in your own life, or you begin to tell someone from outside the Christian worldview, guess what? Jesus is the answer to pain and suffering. His answer is that he suffered with us. Yes, it sounds good, once again, but we need to get down to what that means. Because maybe the next logical question your friend might ask, or maybe you've asked before is, okay, but how does more suffering help us in our suffering? How does the answer, God suffered, yay for suffering, we're all suffering together, how does more suffering actually make me trust this God more? How does that help me? How does it make my suffering livable? How does more suffering save us or show us love? 3 things quickly, okay, because I'm running out of time. First, his suffering is personal. Second, his suffering is perfect. Thirdly, his suffering is powerful. I'm going to unpack those really quickly, okay, so you know where I'm going. First off, his suffering is personal. Jesus is not removed from what we go through, even emotionally, okay? In John 11:35, the shortest verse in the Bible, if you know it, it says, Jesus wept, okay? It's when Lazarus died, his friend. Did you know that the actual original language there, the Greek for that, isn't just wept, it means he snorted, or it almost not just snorting like laughing when you snort, because that was maybe where you're going, but he raged with anger. He was actually sick to his very guts is what that means there. Jesus wept. God himself suffering means he looked at loss in this life. He looked at the end of relationship. He looked at life being ended early. Do you think Jesus didn't know he could bring Lazarus back from the dead? Do you think he was crying because Lazarus died? He was crying because of the pain and suffering that his friends were going through, that he was going through, because his friend's life was cut short. And that's not the way God intended life. He didn't want us to be broken. He didn't want us to lose and to have pain. He snorted. He was sick to his very guts. The Christian answer to the question, where is God when I'm suffering? Is he's right beside you. He's raging, he's grieving, and he's angry that you're having to suffer and that the world is having to suffer, because that's not what he wants. Secondly, his suffering is perfect. Let's look quickly at obviously the most famous form of Jesus' suffering, the cross. Another famous, not from the Christian worldview, psychologist called Sigmund Freud. Maybe you're starting to study him. If you're in the States, you study him in about 10th grade, okay? He says this: when you're pushed to your visceral limit, the real you comes out. I know that's true for me in shameful ways. All I gotta do is bump my head on my daughter's attic bedroom. It's great for hobbits and for 5-year-old girls, okay? I'm not even that tall, and I smack my head about 5 times a day. And you know what? Even from downstairs, Sophia's like, Mom, did you hit your head again? Because me smacking my head elicits from upstairs such a out of me. It shows the real me. It wasn't the attic's fault. It doesn't have a brain. I do, you know? I do. When pushed to your visceral limit, the real you comes out. When Jesus was pushed to his visceral limit, probably more suffering than the majority of humanity will ever face, what came out of Jesus? What does he say? Just look at his responses. Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. Sacrifice is the cost of forgiveness. I'm going to talk about this more later. Sacrifice is the cost of forgiveness. All right? You either sacrifice yourself or you sacrifice the relationship. I'm going to unpack that later. But what comes out of Jesus in his suffering? Sacrificial love. Forgiveness. I'm willing to be in pain so that I don't lose you. What's his other response? He looks and he says, John, can you please take care of my mom? All right, Jesus is just fixing the biggest cosmic problem of pain and suffering in the universe, in time itself. Okay? He knows he's both fully God and fully man. And what does that mean? He still cared about the human relationships he had in the middle of pain and suffering. He's not thinking about himself. He's first thinking about forgiving all of us who don't even care, who didn't ask you, Jesus, to die for me. Have you ever heard that before or thought that before? And then he remembers his mom. Someone take care of her. Don't let her be alone. Then what else does he say? He looks at the thief next to him that earlier was mocking him and jeering him with the other thief to his other side. And when that thief saw the real Jesus coming out in the middle of his suffering, he was like, wow, you're God. You're God, I was wrong. At that point, would you have turned to the person next to you and be like, you're forgiven. You got it at the end of the day? No, most of us probably would have blanked him or ignored him. And Jesus said, today you're going to be with me. It's never too late. You got it. It might have been at the end. You might have just been cursing me, but you got it now. You're included. Nobody is left out of this love and this comfort. And even finally, his final cry, my God, why have you forsaken me? Is what shows us that his suffering is powerful, okay? Powerful and perfect. First off, it's actually powerful in what seemed like powerlessness. All right? Let me unpack that a little bit. Even though the human side of Jesus Christ went, you betrayed me, God. You left me. You turned your back on me. Where in the world are you in this pain? Have you been there? Have you felt that? I remember being about 15 years old, sitting on the sink in the church, outside of the youth group I went to, and I was going through some dark things, and I had known about God all of my life, and I was pretty sure he wasn't there. I was suffering, and I won't go into all the details in such a personal way, and nobody knew. It was so dark. I was screaming at the ceiling going, you're not there. You're not there. if you were there, you'd be doing something for me. Jesus even identifies with that cry, if you've uttered that or you've thought that before. His suffering is powerful first in understanding the powerlessness we all feel at times, the betrayal and the questions that we have. And I don't think we often give enough time to this as Christians when we're talking about pain and suffering, when we're grappling with it ourselves, or when we're talking to the world. A dear friend of mine lost her baby 2 years ago. She was told that he wouldn't live in the womb, but she decided to keep him to term. He lived for 3 weeks, and then he died. They named him and gave him a beautiful burial. And this is what she writes in her journal as she was going through it. I don't think Christians give enough time to the hiatus of suffering and grief before the victory of the resurrection. Suffering is awkward and hurried over. People who are in the thick of grief don't need to be dragged quickly to the empty tomb to meet Jesus. I made a decision that no matter how many unanswered questions or how little I understood of God's power or his powerlessness, his plan, I would not deny Jesus, betray him, or abandon him. Christianity actually gives a response for those of us who feel powerless. What do you think the disciples felt like in those 3 days before Jesus rose from the dead? So his suffering is powerful in powerlessness, but it's also powerful in perfection. I'm ending here. C.S. Lewis put it this way in The End of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, Aslan speaking to the girls. Though the witch knew the deep magic, there is a magic deeper still, which she did not know. If she could have looked back, a little further back, she would have known that when a willing victim who had committed no treachery was killed in a traitor's stead, the table would crack and death itself would start working backwards. There is the resurrection. We don't need to drag people hurriedly to the fact of one day it will all be fixed. But guess what makes that one day suffering will be done through and through, more than just a pipe dream, more than just, and they all lived happily ever after. Guess what is the evidence of the fact that this answer, that God suffers with us, but then not only suffers with us to empathize, puts an end to the suffering. The answer and the evidence is the resurrection of Jesus Christ. There is lots of evidence. I want you to go home and look into it. There's lots of resources we can point you to. Because if the resurrection is true, it moves life beyond the grave and defines for all of us what we cannot define here in this world. It shows us that death is not the end. It doesn't say the suffering didn't matter, but it says there is one day, a finality. The resurrection is not just a fairy tale ending of the Christian story. It's the most crucial element of our faith. Pastor Tim Keller puts it this way: the idea of heaven can be a consolation for suffering, a compensation for the idea of all that we've lost in life. But resurrection is not just consolation, it's restoration. We get it all back. The love, the loved ones, the goods, the beauties of this life, but to new, unimaginable degrees of glory and joy and strength. It is a reversal of the seemingly irreversibility of loss. As a side note there, any of you ever read the book of Job? All the way to the end, what happens? God restores Job's life, right? He restores double the amount of cattle that he had. He gives him double the amount of wealth that he had. Interestingly enough, though, he lost 10 children. How many children does God give Job back? Does he give him 10 or does he give him 20? Double everything else. He only gives him 10. Why? Because death is not the end. His 10 children, for the God who always has been, always will be, and always will continue to be, they're still alive. They're still persons in the presence of God. He didn't need to give double children back because Job, who chose to believe in the midst of suffering in the real God who never changes, who is personal, would see those 10 children again. As Christians, we're confident in the promise of eternal life, not because we've imagined it or visualized it or followed 7 steps to reach it. We're confident of this because Jesus already crossed from death into life. Because of Jesus, we know that this is not the only life. There is so much more. We don't say that glibly when we're suffering or when our friends are suffering. We point them to the Jesus who suffers with them. We hold on to the Jesus that suffers with them. But then we also hold on to the evidence of the resurrection and say, Let your resurrection work bring my heart to life. Let your resurrection work turn my mourning into joy. Let your resurrection work sustain me till the day when I will be completely healed, when my heart won't hurt anymore, when I will see that loved one who died. Have you looked into the evidence for the resurrection? Have you looked into the evidence for life and healing? Do it today. I believe that the Christian answer of Jesus, the God who suffers personally, perfectly, and powerfully, is the best, most robust answer to the problem of pain and suffering anyone in this world ever could or ever will present. Thank you so much for listening, guys. And I'm going to invite Pat back up.